Hi everyone, welcome to our vlog, Transnational Campus Conversations, Building Bridges Between Culture and Identity. My name is Zubaida Lotan and I am a lecturer in urban studies based in the Division of Urban Studies and Social Policy at the University of Glasgow. My contribution to this vlog came from an interest as being part of the learning and teaching community at the University of Glasgow, see how we can produce some creative output and trying to figure out how we can do this in partnership with other institutions and also looking across continents, how we can bridge those discussions. I'd like to introduce my colleague Sarita.
Thank you, Zubeda. Hey, everyone. My name is Sarita Shukla. I use the she, her pronouns, and I am an associate teaching professor within the School of Educational Studies here at the University of Washington, Bothell. I have been participating in this learning community called the Teaching and Learning on the Open Web. That has been an ongoing community, and we've been wrapping our heads around what does teaching learning look like when we think about using varied tools and really thinking about all the different elements of equity, inclusion, as well as a part of this learning community. I learned about this opportunity to do this collaborative work, and I was very excited. And I'm thrilled that I am here talking with Zubeda today.
That's really interesting how we both have a shared interest in thinking about teaching and learning and various aspects. I know that when we started with our collaboration, we were trying to figure out what are some of the commonalities or what are our areas of interest and settled on identity and culture. One of the things that I really would like to find out more from you is how does your identity and cultural background influence your teaching?
Yeah. That's a really powerful question. When I think about identity culture, I think that our own lived experiences play a profound role in the way that we start seeing our own positionalities. I'm currently joining today from the unceded lands and waters of the Sammamish and Duwamish tribes that are part of the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, where I am a settler. I moved here after having graduated from a school where I got my PhD, which is in the territory of the Shawnee and the Cherokee people. I came here from many years in a land that was once colonized. Those vestiges of colonialism, they echo in teaching learning spaces. As I've been thinking about my own experiences, I feel that I'm keenly aware of power and privilege. As I teach and learn, the interaction between power and privilege and my own background affects the way that I even think about teaching learning spaces as well. So that's just in a nutshell. I could go on for hours talking about this, but I would love to hear your own thinking around this.
It's quite interesting how you trace your teaching influences by the spaces in which you grew up and your cultural background, because the same resonates with me. I'm originally from South Africa. All my education is based on the South African system. I had an opportunity to come to the UK to study my master's. You have these very different teaching environments where, on one hand, you taught about memorizing, and it's all about what's in the literature, what can you remember, what can you repeat. Then when you come to the UK, it's very much about free thinking and it's all about critical thinking, and the student needs to put their voice forward. So having that adjustment from one system to the next was something that within a year, I didn't really adjust. So when I left and I came back again for my PhD, I had more of an awareness of, okay, it's expected of me, but you still have that frame of mind. This is how I'm used to doing it. That switch over was quite a challenge. So when I am teaching, I've been teaching for the past 4 years now, I always empathize with my students because I understand what it feels like to come from one system of teaching into another system of teaching. You have to basically start over, but at a rapid rate. You've got this cultural background of your own, but you have a new culture. There's also factors of culture shock, both within the classroom and outside the classroom. So you always have these influencing factors no matter where you are as a student. I think something that I always try to bring in is empathy with all my students to understand, and I try my best to make sure that comes across in what I teach and how I teach. That really just follows on to the ways in which I try to invite my students to bring in their own culture and identity in the classroom. I think it's really important for students to know that their cultural identity does not need to be forgotten about or left behind just because you're in a new system. The course that I teach is planning. I'm really focused a lot on planning. And I encourage my students through comparative examples to reflect on planning in their backgrounds, their lived experience, even, things that they wouldn't consider because a lot of them think you need to have professional experience to be able to bring in those examples. Very often I tell them, no, it's what you see, what you've experienced. You don't have to have the professional background to be able to contribute. I also try to counterbalance this. I bring in comparative examples in my teaching materials. While we do focus a lot on UK examples and Scotland, I really try to bring in my background as well to show them my South African background. This is how my culture, my identity is translated into the teaching material. How is yours? Then I can pick up on some because I'm not an expert and I don't claim to be an expert with all different cultures. So there's always value in
Mhm.
learning students. Another technique is group work and peer discussions because it's one thing to listen to me. Hopefully they listen, but it's another thing for them to be able to share it with their peers and also be able to learn from their peers and to engage the shy or quiet students and also talkative students to say everyone has a voice, everyone's opinion is valued. I'd be interested to hear how you, ways in which you have invited your students to bring their culture and identity into the classroom.
I loved how you connected our own culture and identity with ways in which we're thinking about inviting our students fully into
Mm.
that space as well. Right? The things that you mentioned resonate a lot with me. Acknowledging that we have this underlying value, that we value diversity, and that it's not an add on per se, but it's a fundamental aspect of how we teach and learn. I really appreciated you sharing examples of how you bring in examples not just from one teaching learning space but from other spaces. When I think about inviting the full student into the teaching learning spaces, what I'm most reminded of are my childhood experiences, and knowing that learning is not just a mental process, but it is an emotional process. When I think about inviting the full student, I really think about, to what extent does the student see themselves in the classroom space? One thing that is important for me is, valuing diversity at classroom level, but also thinking carefully about the curriculum materials that I use for my classes. Do I have diverse voices present in the curriculum materials that I use? That they're not just from the dominant perspective, so that students can see a range of ways in which people have engaged with teaching learning. My PhD is in educational psychology, and I teach within the College of Education. A lot of the students that I teach see themselves as prospective teachers. A lot of them also see themselves going into education adjacent fields. Really thinking about, are they first seeing themselves in the teaching learning, in the curriculum materials? Then to invite the full student in, it's important for me to remember that students come from varied backgrounds and life experiences. As a result, we all bring in biases into the classroom space. When I think about biases, how might that show up in small group conversation, in large group conversation? Who speaks the most? Whose voices are valued? So how do I create that level playing field so that students can then be their full self in the classroom? At the beginning of the quarter, for all of my classes, I work on creating collaborative community norms that students and I agree to, right? So students create that. And then there's a lot of negotiations or like small group conversation. Once we have that, I will sign that document and I will invite students to sign that document too. I will put that up on our course Canvas site just as a reminder that these are the norms that we are holding ourselves and each other to. So really thinking about, you know, inviting the full student in also means creating an environment that is fair and is welcoming for each student. On my own part too, I feel that if I want to invite the full student, biases, they are just sort of like floating in the air. We absorb them as a result of our
Mhm.
social interactions. I am always conscious about critically reflecting on my own teaching and asking those questions of myself as well. To what extent is this happening in this space? Who's speaking, who's present, who's absent? How do I engage the full student, all the students? That approach might look different from quarter to
Mhm.
quarter, depending on what I'm seeing in that classroom community as well. When I think about inviting the full student, there are some things that I have found to be beneficial, but then I'm also open to critically thinking about what is it that I need to learn more to advise so that trying to bring the full student in. That's, something that I've been working on. As I think about teaching learning, Isabel, I also think a lot about materials and resources that we use in our teaching learning that we find helpful as we navigate culture and identity in our classes. I would love for each one of us to share resources that we have found to be particularly helpful. So we are on this journey of inviting students of varied backgrounds and cultures into our classroom. Maybe I can just, get us started by
Mhm.
talking about the two. The first resource that I have is this book by Bell Hooks. It's called Teaching to Transgress. Hooks draws from her own experience while she's discussing transformative teaching practices that center justice. A lot of the materials in here have helped me think very critically about creating an inclusive classroom environment that empowers students. The other resource that I have, it's called Equity Unbound. Unbound is an online resource that helps educators think about using activities for online class, for online communities. And I found this resource to be especially helpful when during the pandemic, and this was a work in progress. I too got a chance to contribute to it. I would love to invite you to share your own, examples of books, articles, resources, anything that you
Mhm.
found helpful on this journey.
I mean, those all sound so interesting. Before I discuss my ones, the agreement that you come up with students, I think that's a really helpful resource. It's definitely something I would love to try in my class and just see how that sort of helps when students feel like they've contributed towards something and they also then feel accountable because they have equal share in it and they've already put in what it is they agreed to and they've signed it and I've signed it. I think that would be really interesting to be able to use that sort of resource. I think that's definitely a worthwhile resource to include maybe an example or a snapshot of what it is or how it is that you come up with that. In terms of the actual resources that I use, I'm a big fan of digital tools. One of the biggest things is Mentimeter. I use Mentimeter in two ways. The first one is to engage students. I started doing my presentations on Mentimeter. What I like to do in the beginning of the class is I have a pin image where I've got a different emoji. And I ask students before I start the class, how are you feeling today? They have an array of options, and it is anonymous. Tell me how you're feeling this morning or this afternoon. And you get some really honest answers. You get students that say they're frustrated or they're angry or happy or in love. And you get six students. It's a good way to sort of break the ice, see how everyone's feeling and then a brief comment on it. and then get this class started. You know, Mentimeter has many different interactive components. You've got the polls, survey, students can generate word clouds, or they can ask questions, or they can, give their opinions. The students that are quiet and students that are more outspoken or talkative to be able to still share their ideas, in ways that they feel comfortable, but also get a larger contribution from the class and from students. I found this really helpful in engaging classes where you have over 70 students. You can't always ask, individually to get everybody's opinion, but this way sort of represents discussions and ideas. Then I can upload it to our Moodle site where then students can always revisit. So that's my one bit I tend to like to use. The other one is Padlet. Works in terms of students being able to then expand on their discussions. It's also anonymized, still trying to get the most out of it. I haven't quite mastered Padlet the way I have my Mentimeter, but I still really like these sort of interactive online platforms that students can use. I also use Mentimeter in terms of professional development. I've undertaken some of the courses on Mentimeter to better use polling systems or how to, create engaging lectures. So not just your typical all words, but trying to really bring in that interesting aspect of how to, engage students and make them see like, wow, this is really an interesting topic. Even though you think, oh, this is quite content heavy, but let's deliver it in a way that students engage and are excited. The nice thing with Mentimeter is that students can't jump ahead to the next slide to see what it is. I always ask them to scan the QR code and then they see it on their device and they can't skip ahead. So the slide that I'm talking about is the slide that you're going to see, which is really good in keeping their attention and their focus as well. Those are the two resources that I'd like to highlight.
I tend to use Padlet back to a previous question too about bringing the full student in. Isn't it wonderful when we, have that at the front of the class and where you see students' responses up there and not sort of it's them that's up there, not us as instructors. I really appreciate you sharing about Mentimeter. I've heard about it, but I have not quite applied it as much. So uh, now I feel like I should go investigate Mentimeter.
This has been an absolutely great vlog. There's so much more to unpack in terms of culture and identity, how us as educators bring in our own culture and identity, but then also, recognizing the bias that, every brings with them. You can't escape them. But you very interestingly put, you need to reflect on what are your biases as an educator, but also reflect on what can you do to improve it. What can you do to change things, and what are you observing in your class? I've really enjoyed this vlog and being able to have this discussion with you.
Same here, Zubeda. I think it's powerful to find similarity in experiences, but yet just such unique experiences that I've had to have this conversation about just our own, sort of like how do we see cultural identity, and then I've experienced it, but also thinking about that in the context of teaching, learning, and our work with our students. Well, with that, we thank everyone who is here and has joined us. So much for watching.
And feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to hear your thoughts and any suggestions you may have.